Hello everyone, hope you all had a happy Halloween this year. Today I'm gonna introduce my journey as a security researcher, and this is gonna be my longest public talk ever, so for the better quality, I wrote down the entire script and used Google synthesized voice to conduct the speech. Alright, here we go.
I'm a jailbreak enthusiast since I was a kid. The night I was waiting for Evasion developers release iOS 6 Jailbreak was unforgettable. That's when I was a middle school kid. I've got no other words to describe it. It was just absolutely amazing. Their talk at 2013 Hack in the Box revealed the secrets behind the jailbreaking. The topic was fascinating and the amount of work that has been done is unbelievable. However, I couldn't really comprehend all that things mentioned in the slide, as well as many other things described in the famous iOS Hacker's Handbook. It's some sort of black magic nobody understands. And that is what intrigues me a lot. Talking about my background, I'm from China, in my tiny little city. And people around me. Back then, it's extremely rare to see someone who has good understanding at computer and English. And there were controversies all over the country about whether the new generation should be allowed to access the Internet. I was merely a teenage back then or even younger. The society doesn't take our words for real. I really believe many of you out there can relate to what I'm saying. So the computer device was almost considered as a new type of drug. And parents would send their kids to boarding school to keep them away from the Internet. And the school apparently cannot possibly teach what they do not understand and believe. I went to boarding school from the first grade all the way until the end of my school life. Towards the end of the primary school, I began to question the meaning of school. 'Cause for so many years I had been doing everything everybody told me and it just doesn't feel right. I get blamed and punished when I want to spend more time with myself, study my interest. So it took me several years persuading my parents to let me out. And that was the toughest thing I ever done in my life. I was literally fighting for my own time and freedom to learn what I want to learn. However, don't take me wrong though. I'm not saying school is useless. My experience with school has taught me some important life lessons that I will never forget. They are quite simple, but it's impossible to truly understand them if you haven't been in that kind of situations before. I appreciate my time and freedom more than ever after dropout. I was so excited when first time I had a chance to come to America by myself attending a conference. The 2015 Jailbreak Con in San Francisco. I was the youngest attendee there. 'Cause a person who drives me there. He is the first American one ever met whose name is Alfred. He was so worried about me since I barely understand any English. So he found a female staff who is working on site and asked for some help. I believe her name was Britta. So Britta introduced me to another attendee who was the only person beside me speaking Chinese. His name was Larry. And later he becomes a very good friend to me. So is Alfred. It was so exciting to see the man behind the mysterious app Cydia. And along with many other jailbreakers. I appreciate they uploaded the video on YouTube. It's so reminiscent of the past. Many people have brought me interest in learning jailbreak. And I am deeply grateful for that. After that, I traveled back or forth multiple times to America by myself. Didn't do much fun things but visiting libraries and makerspace. That is something I really love about America. Whether as public library or university or college library. Everyone has free access and it's not crowded at all. And then makerspace is usually a non-profit business. Where people share tools and a rented place. It gives you really positive feeling about learning. And focusing on something you're interested. I really think they are gifts for people who living in America. So please don't take them for granted. Alright, now let's get to the technical topic. I'll share the detail of how I jailbreak since iOS 12. Here is the outline of the talk. We will first review what is iOS Sandbox and evaluate its weaknesses. What benefits can an attacker get out of it? And I made a couple of diagrams to visualize the strength or intensity of the current iOS Sandbox, and then compare it to the past few years. Summarize the improvement Apple has been made. So Sandbox is a general term rather than a specific security mechanism. And almost all modern operating systems now have some kind of sandbox design. iOS or iPadOS, as a system mainly running on the mobile device, is in favor of very stringent restrictions. Sandboxing gives a higher level of access control for a different process. It's similar to the privacy panel in iOS settings but way more powerful than that. And it lets Apple neutralize many kinds of vulnerabilities in a very short period of time, with almost no overhead added. It's definitely one of the revolutionary designs in the evolution of computer security. iOS has its own sandbox design. The restrictions placed on a process depend on 4 conditions. By default, we cannot alter any of the listed 4 conditions on a regular iOS device. But it's good to know them as later we will talk about escalation. I'm gonna go through each of them quickly. So the first one, all files on iOS must have a code signature to run. There is no exception. Trust cache is a list of hash stored in the iOS kernel binary. So it's static. All the system files have been signed this way. And the different versions of the iOS shipped it differently. So you cannot swap execution files across different versions of iOS because they wouldn't be able to run. But on macOS, they can. So the attacker can just copy and paste an old Apple signed file with the vulnerability that allowing the attacker to take over the execution. Then all of a sudden, malicious activities can be disguised in an Apple signed process, which usually displayed as green, meaning trusted in the antivirus software. One of the antivirus software I have used that reports some very useful information was developed by an Apple hacker, Patrick Wardle. It scans and verifies all process code signature, which is a very effective method. Since code signature is fundamentally protected by cryptographic algorithms, bad guys are extremely unlikely to be able to crack it. This app displays App Store apps as the black secured lock, and the trick I mentioned earlier could give us the green lock like other system processes. The attacker could blend into the surroundings perfectly to survive the security inspection. Then signed by Apple basically means all the App Store apps. Although you cannot directly interfere with the signing process, it still remains exploitable as someone could leave a backdoor in their app and later execute malicious code through the app. Charlie Miller, one of the authors of the iOS Hacker's Handbook, did it back in 2011. Despite that, the iOS doesn't allow you to run unsigned code, whether it's files or memory. So far, arbitrary code execution still achievable through complicated ROP or JOP programming. The pointer authentication technology didn't stop it completely. It just made it harder. The last situation, signed by third-party developers, is only allowed to possess certain entitlements that won't break the sandbox. The next one is the path of execution. All third-party applications on iOS are automatically placed in a containerized environment because of the path they have been running on. They have limited access to all kinds of resources such as files, services, kernel APIs, use functions like fork or execute. And we refer to this as the default application sandbox. This is the thing we want to break out of it. Everyone is familiar with this one. The Unix user id. 'Cause iOS as well as macOS is a Unix-like system. But something interesting is that iOS has so many other privilege separation designs. obtaining the top privilege that usually is the root. On iOS doesn't really mean you can do all kinds of things since there are other restrictions. So it's the least useful one you are looking for. Alright. The last one is the entitlements and the seatbelt profiles. This is the real deal when it comes to Sandbox escape. They represent the actual access rights and are capable of restraining all kinds of activities. Further refined down to the level of each individual process. All processes except a few at least have some entitlements. Whereas, for the seatbelt profiles, only a small portion is using it. And they are often the critical ones that are directly accessible from Safari or App Sandbox. This happens because they are actually two different things. For the entitlements, as its name, a lot of time, they were used for giving rights to access something. Without the appropriate entitlements, you can still establish connections to service or kernel APIs. But at the end of the day, the connection will be rejected. How far you can go before that happens is going to depend on when they decide to check your entitlements. This is the essential difference between entitlements and seatbelt profiles, cause seatbelt profiles are born to prevent the connection from happening. Now, let's mention kernel a little bit. Kernel, as its name, is the core of the operating system. Although it sounds like it has a lot of power. And indeed, it does. Nowadays, the kernel is kinda fallen off its throne. Separate chip and hardware protection attracts more eyes, and the next promising hardware protection is the memory tagging extension. I am all excited to see it. The term attack iOS kernel has a wide meaning. But I only refer to obtain the capability of reading and writing virtual memory in kernel space. Certainly, that is not the end of the hacking. After that, you still have pointer authentication and page protection layer to bypass. And these are backed up by the hardware protection. If you want to learn more about them, you should study the presentation Apple did in Black Hat last year. The name is Behind the Scenes of iOS and Mac Security. Also, I had to mention a very impressive researcher whose name is Brandon Azad. He published many related works when he was working at Google Project Zero. All good stuffs. Even if you don't have the motivation to hack them now. Still worth spending time to read them cause security technologies are advancing fast. We might start seeing them used in other devices in the future. Back to iOS kernel, 99% of the time. You have to get to the kernel in order to disable some of the most prominent security mechanisms. And one of them is code signing. It controls the freedom to run any binaries. And this is the least thing you can do in order to be called a rootless jailbreak. But why is 99% instead of 100%? Because there are always special cases in the past and the present. Like the Chekra1n project relies on a bootrom exploit. It's rare, and now, with the new mitigation introduced in iOS 14, even future we develop another bootrom exploit. Use it to jailbreak is no longer an easy task anymore. Overlapping segment attack against DYLD to achieve untethered jailbreak. First appearance in iOS 6 jailbreak tool. Then similar approach shown on every public jailbreaks. Until after Pangu 9, Apple seems finally eradicated this issue. And we had to mention Brandon Azad again because of his impressive work. I'm pretty much amazed when I'm reading his open source project, Blanket. He bypassed code signing without first getting kernel read and write. Yet many of the techniques he used are now patched as the aftermath. So for now, I'd say it's extinct. Now our only option is to find and exploit kernel vulnerabilities. This has becomes the common approach. Especially when you targeting the latest device. Many recent jailbreaks include all my jailbreaks are in this category. Now let's talk about how to get to the kernel. There are two common ways to do so. I made two diagrams for easier understanding. Both of them are still being seen today. But you probably have seen more of the first one, which attacking kernel through interfaces that are directly accessible from within the sandbox. These interfaces usually have a long history, suggesting that many others may have studied it in the past. That makes it hard to find your own zero-day. But it's not an impossible task though, since Apple keeps adding more new syscalls every year. And syscalls aren't like iOS APIs, most of them, if not all of them, don't require the caller to have certain entitlements. Vulnerability of this type are valuable because oftentimes they can be exploited from the Safari sandbox. Combine with WebKit RCE. You can build a remote attacking chain and attending hacking events. While the second one, it has a lot lesser value and does not sound as cool as the first one. In this case, you split one goal into multiple goals. Escalate privilege in Userland, and attack kernel components that usually cannot be directly accessed. To be frank, all my jailbreaks are in this scope. Soon after, I'll explain why I do prefer finding bugs in this category. Now back to the first type. The more valuable one. Did I mention that most of the cases you heard of are probably belong to this category? That is right. Here is a list of them. Many are used in public jailbreaks and have been thoroughly analyzed. The write-ups are all public. You can search for them on Google. Google Project Zero is really fulfilling their duty, which is making zero-day harder. You can get a long list of high-risk vulnerabilities discovered by Google Project Zero members. Congratulations for them. They not only working hard to discover new zero days but also very good at collecting and analyzing samples. They have done a number of investigations of zero-day exploits being used in active attacks. And all are published in their blog, which is wonderful. Frankly speaking, the iOS security community has grown so much compared to 7 or 8 years ago. We have got a lot more security researchers actively studying iOS. And every once a while, we see a new research article made public by someone or some company. Just like many other things in life, when you have more players join the game, the competition inevitably will be more intense than ever. Here is a list of different types of people or entities who may be interested in such a bug. You see, you got other researchers who are sponsored by the company or individuals planning to participate in hacking events. It's getting popular. More companies willing to organize such events nowadays. Besides the well-known Pwn2Own, then there are cyber arms dealers who are making fully functional offensive products. Private acquisition companies. From Europe and Israel. Well, they may sound shady, but they are actually the best case you may encounter. 'Cause they don't do free giveaway that often. After all and down to earth, what does independent researcher care about the most? It may not just represent iOS but also other bug hunting fields. At the end of the day, after you got yourself some CVEs, if you decide to go full-time, these are what you care about the most. iOS does contain many bugs. But only a handful of them are exploitable. The rest of them a researcher might able to get a CVE and credit on Apple's website. But almost certain that Apple or other bug bounty programs will not award the researcher for them because practically these bugs are not posing a real threat to the user. I think many researchers often stuck in here keep finding more bugs that are considered not exploitable. Speaking from my experience, they got distracted by them. One of my talk's goals is to give these people some inspiration to find their first exploitable iOS bug. Soon later, I'll evaluate iOS attacking surfaces in terms of exploitability. And I want to explain the terminology for newcomers. What is bug collision? It's simple. It means your bug has been discovered by someone else. and he decided to report it or publish it earlier than you. This means much less return for your research in terms of profit and credit. And that is if the research is still worth some value. Now, if you look back at the second type of the bug, it doesn't look that mediocre anymore. Isn't it? After all, it meets all your needs. I have personally experienced a bug collision a few times. But never with bugs in this category. It's almost surprising how long they lasted. Alright. And that is why I prefer to find such bugs. And next, I'll be focusing on analyzing this category. So in this category, we are first looking for userland bugs instead of kernel ones. We need something that provides us the extra privilege. And they must be useful to open up more kernel attack surface. Back to the entitlements thing. Another side of the story is that iOS is not perfect. In reality, it still has a number of system processes that lack the necessary restrictions in place. You can even see bad use internally. That is our ticket to get out of the app sandbox. Imperfections are opportunities in the bug hunting world. After sorted things out, among the combination of all the different entitlements, these four particular ones are standing out. A daemon could have all of them or none of them. We need to build a good filter. It is worth noting that the attacker can perform limited malicious operations without compromising the kernel. Like such. Have access to the file system outside of the sandbox means the attacker could read data across different applications. If you can call functions like fork and execute to run other binaries, that opens up another attack surface in the userland. There are binaries that allow you to take over them by running them. And the last twos, as its name, they are free to access. Then I gotta mention that, unfortunately, everyone listed here is not as free as it sounds. Here is another layer of limitations. The root file system, where almost all the system files at, doesn't allow anyone to write any files even you are not in the sandbox. It's another layer of security. And technically on iOS, you need to have read and write access to the kernel memory in order to patch it. And for userland mock services and iOKit APIs, it's not rare to see they checking for special entitlements. If you don't have it, we can almost say we don't have access to those services. If you break down all the daemons and classify them by comparing access to userland service and kernel APIs, the map will look a bit like this. Well, the two light green colors representing daemons that have free access to all kernel APIs, which include all the iOKit drivers. They are the ideal trampolines to reach the kernel. And then the dark green is the daemon that only has unrestricted access to userland services. It has more contact surface with the two light green colors. Most of these light green daemons we cannot reach them within the sandbox. And that is when the dark green comes in handy. Black and gray daemons are not that attractive. Especially when we haven't finished picking all the low-hanging fruits yet. So those greens are our targets. I connected A and B together because they are only conceptually distinct. Statistically speaking, except for those daemons that used seatbelt profiles, all daemons that have free access to kernel APIs also have free access to userland services. So what about the ones that used seatbelt profiles? I basically just rule out everything that has used them. They are relatively more secure. Especially with those who have personalized seatbelt profiles. Alright, now we have only two interesting categories left. A, B and C. We gonna give them new colors that indicate the level of security risk. Okay. Alright, so for the unsandboxed ones, baby blue. And if they are directly accessible from within the app sandbox, then we mark those as red. 'Cause once we take over one of these, we are free of the sandbox. It's that simple. Moreover, for the semis, we use light ginger and pink if they are accessible from within the app sandbox. They are dangerous as well. We can use them as a bridge to attack more A and B targets. Alright, now it's time to see some statistical data which intuitively reflects the continuous strengthening of the sandbox. I have collected such data from 3 different major versions. So the first one is iOS 12.4.1. You can see the red area. Almost has a size of walnut. Again, soon as we take over one of them in the red area, we are out of sandbox. Completely. And then it's just matter of time until you find good bug in the kernel. Let's put on another one and compare them both. The total number of the service is increasing as Apple adding more features to the system. iOS 13 had some minor improvement. But nothing significant. The red area still has the size of a walnut. Well, if you compare it to the first generation of iOS which released 12 years ago. At that time, the entire circle was filled up with red. Then yes, iOS 13 is much more secure. But the fact is that none of these red color should be exist. And they are the typical examples of lacking restrictions. And the fact that iOS 13 has one less high-risk targets was also because of external information. I have another sandbox escaping bug that was reported during the iOS 12. Apple eventually fixed it in iOS 13.2. However, they have sandboxed it when iOS 13 came out. That is why I stated that the sandboxing is a powerful mitigation. They don't need to understand the details of how a vulnerability works before patching it. Despite that as a temporary patch, it worked. It cannot be used as a bridge to attack kernel anymore. I had to find another sandbox escaping bug to replace it. That didn't take too long. I'll explain it after. To add more sense, this is a conceptual diagram shows how a Userland vulnerability leads to kernel attack before iOS 14. You don't even care about the dark green targets. Let alone the black and grays. Because Apple didn't fix the overall sandbox problem, I was able to quickly locate another sandbox escaping bug with the target filter I built. And continue jailbreak the latest iOS 13. And something even more ironic is that Apple has also failed to fix the kernel bug. I want to say something after experiencing through this. Apple is a slow responder. And they have failed to fix bugs in one go. Lack the ability to thoroughly investigate the issue and hence other place may still exposed to the same weakness. Apple also lets bug regressions happen. I have no idea how that happened. That is outright internal threat. Apple is a big corporation. The internal management must be super complicated. Nevertheless, maybe Apple is not the best active defensive player. But still an excellent company. I appreciate Apple. Some much smaller companies who make their own brand of mobile phones are retarded if compared to Apple. No derogatory meaning. There are just so many companies are not even caring about security vulnerabilities. I love Apple. We love Apple. iOS 14 has made notable advancements in the security of the sandbox. Apple has completely eliminated the red area, and significantly reduced the size of pink area. By introducing a new entitlement. For the first time, the amount of baby blue and ginger color starts to appear inconsistent. However, that did not end the career of the sandbox escaping bugs yet. This is a new diagram shows possible routes to reach kernel through sandbox escaping bug on iOS 14. As long as baby blue's still there, sandbox escaping isn't ended. But for sure to do it on iOS 14 is more complicated. Now you need to put 2 or more Userland bugs together. I know it's feasible. 'Cause I already done it on iOS 14. In the optimum case, Apple needs to eliminate all colors. However, consider debugging capability. Maybe a few have to be excluded. And you should see something like this. Well, now let's get back to iOS 13. Since that's the topic of this talk, I want to show you some negligence in the iOS sandbox. Some of them been fixed on iOS 14. But definitely not all of them. There are a variety of seemingly sandbox-related entitlements been used to restrict daemons. I'm sure you have seen them if you have tried reverse engineering on iOS. Among all these options, only a few have the actual effect on blocking access to kernel APIs and Userland services. The A blocks access to other apps' data in the file system, but it will not interfere with access to the kernel and other Userland mock services. These targets are good for using as a bridge. And then the B is almost as if it's not there. And the rest of the green options, they don't work alone. Ironically, you can see a lot of misuse cases like this one. I believe what Apple wants is to restrict its access only to a Userland service that has been highlighted. But in fact, this daemon has no sandbox at all. It's almost like a bluff. It's so misleading to have that entitlement because it contains the word security. Next part. I'll talk about how did I build my target filter, which leads to discovery of many Userland bugs. So among all the light green targets, there was 55 of them on iOS 13. I have applied other conditions for a better result. And they were super effective. And I thought it's interesting to share with you guys what I was thinking. So the first type of daemons I would get rid of is those who running as root. In the scenario of Sandbox escaping, root is quite worthless but reminds Apple engineers to raise security awareness. And attracts other researchers to come over and finding bugs. Then the second type of daemons I don't like is those who used NSXPC. Instead of C-style XPC library. Using NSXPC implies a fair amount of Objective-C code was used, if not all of it. Not using NSXPC doesn't mean there is no Objective-C code, but it is telling us that more or less C code also been used. And if you have studied enough cases on iOS, you will notice that most dangerous problems stick with the programming language C and its variant C++. The same explanation goes to the question of why I skipped programs that are written by Swift. After rule out the daemons that met those conditions, I got only 3 ideal targets left. And by the time I found out this, the authentication broker agent and symptoms D was also used on macOS. It was rather an easy task to discover and exploit this bug since we have the unparalleled debugging capability on macOS. And then Apple removed it from macOS after version 10.15. I was in that perfect time gap. Since reverse engineering frameworks on iOS is a big nuisance. This bug probably gonna last really long if I didn't report it. So this is where the vulnerability located at. Long story short, Objective-C runtime is problematic. And this issue is sort of like the classic format string problem in C and C++. Sometime the user can control the selector string that will later used for executing a Objective-C method. In most cases, the attacker could pass the string delock. That will deallocate whatever object has been called on, which constitutes a use after free. However, that is not the case here, because the next function will inevitably crash the process, and there was no time for us to spray data over the memory that gets released. Especially when the symptoms D doesn't support asynchronous execution through XPC. So we gotta find other ways to exploit it. Let us take a look at these two variables, the additional info generator and additional info selector, how they been given value. The code pass a user-controlled string to a class method class representative for name method, and its returned value is given to the additional info generator variable. By reverse engineering the class representative for name method, we can find a dictionary containing the relationship between the name and the class it represents. The debugger on macOS has made this really easy to do. For an instance, the highlighted part shows if we pass the string certificate errors, the class representative for name method will returns a class that has internal variable with names such as additional handler, max age, min count. And then if we search these keywords in the disassembler, we can find out that the class name is simple rule condition. With more digging into it, these variables they appear to be controlled by user input data, so whatever value we pass in through XPC dictionary that's under the key required minimum count, will be used to set min count. If you look at here again, we can now control the pointer returned from object message send which is labeled as v21 pointer. With fully controlling over v21 pointer and the memory it points to, we can now avoid crash that is supposed to happen in the use after free situation. And v21 will get passed to decision details set additional info, setting an instance variable of the class decision details, and gets released during the deal location of decision details instance. It should make sense now. To make the analysis more complete, I will continue to track when and how the pointer we passed in been released. So our fake pointer now is stored in a decision details class instance. We need to manage to release that decision details class instance, and that will straight leads to arbitrary code execution. It's same as calling object release with a pointer under our control, and it's a common scenarios in different Userland exploit. The same payload code can be reused at this point to achieve code execution. Decision details class instance is bound to a managed event class instance, through the same XPC service that allows the attacker to create multiple managed event class instance. Decision details class instance gets release when belonged managed event class instance releases, and that happens inside the following function. The highlighted variable which is called managed events. It's an array, contains all the managed event class instances, and the first managed event class instance been added to the array gets released when array count reaches 6. If you go to study my exploit code, it may be easier to understand. And that was how this vulnerability being exploited. And takeaways is the keyword perform selector and bunch of similar stuff. Since the secret has now been revealed, I'm gonna dropping 0 days too. The first one was good before iOS 13. Now is being sandboxed. Make it worthless. The second one is possible to be triggered from the file. The file is located under one of the system frameworks. Since the root file system on iOS remains read-only before you reach the kernel, this one cannot be used for jailbreak. Alright. That was the end of the Userland exploitation. After we break out of the sandbox, we will then attacking the weak part of the kernel. The Apple Video Encoder is a graphics iOS driver that runs in kernel space and exists only on iOS and just like many other iOS-exclusive drivers. It's not open source and most of the symbols have been removed. And it cannot be accessed from the App Sandbox. Also back in 2017. The same driver has been exploited badly and Apple gave it a complete makeover after iOS 14. Here is the external methods of this driver. We mainly use method at index 7 to encode a client buff. It basically means to load many I/O surfaces object through IDs provided from the Userland. and then calling method at index 6 to trigger multiple security flaws located inside the highlighted function. And then this map shows the relationship between involved objects and structures. Then I put all the structures together and formed another map that clearly shows the connections between them. Unfortunately, Apple didn't patch it well back in 2017. And this phenomenon is also seen in other drivers. Apple has not paid enough attention to drivers that require Sandbox escape to access. The detail of this exploit has made public. You can find them online. Alright. Now let's look at the next one. This is my second time exploiting the same graphics driver. This time is way more complex. Let's take a look at the workflow. You will notice that I will mention this variable here multiple times throughout the explanation. This variable, which I call it mapping from user, is a kernel variable, contains the address of a memory mapping across Userland and kernel. Both sides can read and write this memory simultaneously. Which brings up the race condition problem. The way Apple AVE used this memory was unsafe. Use mapping from user as a temporary variable to store kernel pointer, potentially leaking kernel pointers and giving attackers the time window to replace the kernel pointer during the execution of Apple AVE2 driver. Set session settings. Timestamp will be written to a specific offset at mapping_from user, leaving a huge advantage for attackers to win the race condition. By taking the advantage of the memory race condition, we can build some gadgets that will be handy later. And these are the 3 gadgets. They are all around 40 bytes long memory. They can be used to allocate, release, or empty a 40 bytes long memory. Now we can proceed to achieve the key step, which is to leak the memory mapping address but in kernel space. I initially thought it was impossible. But somehow I did it. And it was really magical. Since we can allocate and leak kernel 40 bytes memory through one of the gadgets, we can try something like this. By continuously allocating and releasing 40 bytes long memory using these gadgets, collecting every leaked address and observing certain patterns within them, we can predict or deduce that one of these leaked addresses has been or will be occupied by our desired target, which is an OS data instance which also has 40 bytes long size. Regarding the method of allocating OS data in kernel, please refer to Rotten Apples by Adam Donenfeld. This method allows us to reread the data carried by OS data after allocated it, which is very important as we are going to override its data pointer, to leak informations. We keep leaking more memory addresses. We collect them in an array called paveway memory. Then collect 2 of them, put them in another array called trap memories, because they are like holes in heap feng shui. And then allocate a new one. Now release all of them. Since an OS data instance is also 40 bytes long, it's possible that it fell into one of the blocks we just released. The difficult part is how do we know if that happens and which address exactly? 'Cause if we guessed it wrong, the panic will happen. We can predict if that will happen by using following strategies. By the end we will have 10 addresses saved. I discovered 2 simple patterns that is giving out information we want. This is the first pattern. The third trap memory appears repeatedly after every 2 addresses. In this case, we can deduce that the second OS data instance has occupied the address of the third trap memory. And there is the second pattern. A new address that's other than anything stored in the trap memories appears repeatedly. In this case, we can deduce that the first OS data instance has occupied the address of first trap memory. These two patterns will tell us the exact address of an OS data instance. These two recognition patterns work greatly across different iOS devices and versions. If none of them were found, back to the step of collecting trap memories, repeat the entire process until a pattern is successfully recognized. Also, all used addresses can be recycled by one of the gadget afterwards. So now we have an OS data instance with a known kernel address. Next step is to overwrite the data pointer from the help of another gadget. Then we can read the following structure through the OS data instance. This structure contains the target variable. However, very unfortunate, the one we leaked is empty. It's so tired and unnecessary to explain the logic here, since I have every steps written in the white paper. So let's skip some steps and just get to the point. Basically, after we leaked the variable mapping from user, we now have the power to read and write any kernel memory data using temporary primitives I found. They are being labeled as temporary because those functions have some limits when using them. The first one is they don't work every time. The race condition may fail and still give us a valid kernel pointer, so because of that double check is needed to ensure that the data we got was correct. We have to call the function multiple times until the same result appears twice. Then the second one is they do affect the surrounding memory and vice versa, so we can only use them while every effects can take into consideration. For this reason, we cannot read vtable pointer out of the leaked instances since they are in the first row of the heap, and the data in the addresses before it is not predictable. I have to locate another primitive for reading memory. It's a lot reverse engineering work. At the end, I found a new memory read primitive that is not based on race condition. Then we read out our task structure. Insert a fake task for PID0 port using the temporary memory write primitive. That is it. We are done. Then I reported to Apple during iOS 13. Apple fixed it by destroying the read and write primitive I was using. Well, they didn't fix it thoroughly. I guess part of the reason is that they were reprogramming the driver on iOS 14. Besides that, Apple also fixed a critical part of building a fake task for PID0 port. Which means now you have to develop custom kernel read and write primitive before injecting task for PID0. Next, this diagram shows that part of the workflow has been patched on 13.6. Then the diagram on the right shows the new steps to achieve custom kernel read and write. It's actually kinda silly, it's the same function that Apple has tried to patch. Still giving us the power to read memory and empty any 1 byte long memory. I have mentioned this from the very beginning that all client buffs forming a double-linked list. So I leverage the writing gadget to set 2 lower bits of the linking pointer to 0. It then points back to a memory that we have complete control over. It means that we can control the previous client buff pointer, and if we can manage to leak the address of Apple AVE2 user client instance and let the check pass, we can dominate the entire client buff that is about to go through set session settings function. It turns out to be completely exploitable. We can set up a fake client buff. And looking for new ways to read and write kernel memory. Without rely on task for PID0. We can reuse the previously mentioned stable read primitive. And it didn't take too long for me to find another memory write primitive. Because client buff is a huge structure. Lots of code was used. So this is the new memory write primitive. All variables highlighted in yellow are under our control. Through unique client ID member of the client buff, 32 bits long memory can be written every time. It's not perfect, but much better than that unstable write primitive. We can then build task for PID 0 again. And it's all the same after that.
So pretty much that's the end. If you have anything you want to say, just contact me through the email.